SUVs have been around for a long time, and even to this day, they continue to be one of the most lucrative segments of the automobile industry at large. But why are SUVs so popular in the first place? In this video, we'll be taking a deep dive into the SUV industry, the history behind it all, and trying to figure out why people love SUVs so much. So without further ado, let's dive in.
Built Ford tough. The rules have changed. Ford Expedition, the only way to get there.
To understand why people love SUVs so much, we have to go back to the very beginning. SUV-like vehicles date back to the 1930s and 40s, but they usually consisted of one-off models like the 1935 Chevrolet Suburban or the International Harvester Travelall. These were vehicles that were only marketed towards enthusiasts, not the mass market. It wasn't until 1983 that the first mass-market SUV, the Jeep Cherokee, was released. Back then, the term used to describe these cars was sports wagon by Jeep. The car was designed in collaboration with Renault, giving it a more European look than all of the other major models in the United States. It was also the first Jeep to be sold in Europe, although it was under the Renault badge. The Cherokee was an immediate success. The four-door, four-wheel drive model was sold for $12,524 at the time, which is the equivalent to around $35,000 today. Even though this isn't cheap by any means, it was still pretty economical when compared to any other car with sports capabilities at the time. The sales of the Cherokee were also helped by low gas prices in the mid-80s oil glut. Soon enough, competitors to the Cherokee started to emerge. The Dodge Raider, Mitsubishi Pajero, Jeep Wagoneer, Suzuki Samurai, and GMC Jimmy all became viable competitors in both the US and international markets. But there was another thing that caused this surge in SUV models: regulation. Back in the 70s, the US introduced the Corporate Average Fuel Economy, or CAFE standard, to regulate and decrease fuel usage. This made heavy mileage vehicles too expensive for the average consumer to buy. However, there were more relaxed regulations for light trucks. Even though the regulations were relaxed for commercial light trucks, Jeep and all of the other SUV makers decided to classify their passenger SUVs as light trucks. This meant that there was less tax on these vehicles, making them cheaper and easier for consumers to pick up. This also allowed SUVs to be way more powerful than the average passenger vehicle, which gave them a reputation among consumers for their power. SUVs were a better alternative to sedans in almost every way. Most of the time, they were much better built. They had sturdy exteriors that could take a beating. Their off-road capabilities meant that people were able to venture into areas with no paved roads or infrastructure as easily as they would on a freeway. They were also much better equipped at handling snow, something that automakers struggled with in sedans. SUVs were considered safe, and considering the fact that, like sedans, they were mainly marketed towards families, this was crucial in getting sales. SUVs were also better suited for larger families since they had more seating capacity than any other vehicle. This also made them extremely popular among teens and young adults, as this meant that you could fit as many friends in your car as possible. Basically, if you were a teen and you had an SUV, you were automatically one of the cool kids. They were much more convenient than pickup trucks, which often formed the base of most SUVs, since the space that was normally occupied by a cargo bed was usually used for more seating space. And finally, SUVs simply looked great. It was the perfect combination of power and elegance. Throughout the 1980s and early 90s, there was a massive surge in SUVs. Owning an SUV almost became a status symbol. However, they weren't truly widespread just yet. On top of that, in 1994, the US updated its environmental regulations to finally include SUVs as passenger vehicles as well. So the tax cuts weren't as lucrative as before. This led to automakers trying to come up with something new for the market, and the result was this. In 1994, Toyota and Subaru started to produce the RAV4, which came out in 1995. This became the world's first crossover SUV. It had all the main features of an SUV, such as four-wheel drive, off-roading capabilities, and a similar form factor. However, it was slightly smaller than a traditional SUV, somewhere between that and a sedan. This gave birth to a new wave of crossover SUVs. By 1999, for the first time in history, SUVs started to outsell regular passenger cars. Even though the SUV craze was still strong throughout the 90s, there was also increasing demand for crossover SUVs in the 2000s. Crossovers were particularly popular among female drivers and urban drivers. A traditional SUV would simply be too large to drive around in dense cities, harder to park, and they generally get worse mileage. Crossovers mostly addressed all of those problems. By 2003, 1/3 of all cars in the United States consisted of SUVs. They were now truly widespread. But for much of the 2000s, the lines between crossover and traditional SUVs started to blur more and more, particularly due to advancing technology. A lot of the downsides of a traditional SUV, including the fact that they were difficult to drive, simply didn't exist anymore in the 2000s. Now, SUVs were as easy to drive as an automatic Toyota Corolla. On top of that, the feeling of bigger is always better stayed with consumers. But in the late 2000s, for the first time since the introduction of the Jeep Cherokee in the 1980s, SUV sales started to drop. This was mainly due to extremely high oil prices, and with SUVs being just about the worst vehicles for mileage out there, people simply couldn't afford to drive SUVs. On top of that, they had terrible resale value. Most people who drove SUVs drove them with no limits, and this led to a negative effect on the resale market as a whole, whether the cars were damaged or not. But automakers knew that this would happen, and they had a plan to handle this problem. In 2005, Ford entered a licensing agreement with Toyota to create the world's first hybrid SUV called the Ford Escape Hybrid. The demand for this car ended up being 4 times as high as Ford had initially planned. GM eventually released hybrid versions of full-sized SUVs like the Chevrolet Tahoe, GMC Yukon, and the Cadillac Escalade in 2007 and 2009, which were just as successful. Hybrid SUVs sort of led to a resurgence in sales in this category, primarily because they addressed the biggest issue people had with SUVs: mileage. By the 2010s, after the Great Recession, SUV sales started to recover. On top of that, practically every major brand in the world, from GM to Toyota to Volkswagen, started to make their own hybrid SUVs. It was just what the market needed at the time. And soon enough, another player would emerge that would completely change the SUV landscape: Tesla. After revolutionizing sedans with the Tesla Model S, the company finally released the Tesla Model X crossover SUV in 2015. This was one of the world's first fully electric SUVs. It had a gorgeous exterior and interior combining elements of minimalism and futurism, and it immediately became Tesla's most widely loved model. It was able to go 360.4 miles on a single charge using absolutely no gas at all. This was unprecedented for SUVs, but it was only a matter of time before the competition would catch up. Today, most automakers are shifting from hybrid and gas engines to electric ones. Electric vehicles have also proven to be extremely popular among consumers, often scoring high in satisfaction ratings. However, they are a bit too expensive for the average consumer, but prices are expected to come down as technology advances. In 2019, 40% of all new vehicles sold worldwide were SUVs, their highest market share at any point in history. In the US, that number was up to 48%. Today, SUVs are popular for many of the same reasons we mentioned earlier. They're safe, durable, beautiful, attractive to families and young people, adventurous, versatile, and big. But on top of those benefits, SUVs have now gotten rid of many of their traditional downsides, which included high mileage, environmental effects, and more importantly, parking. There was a time when it was impossible to park an SUV, but now SUVs will literally park for you. Cars are becoming smarter each day, and SUV manufacturers are making full use of the technology. It has gotten to the point where there's very little reason for people to even buy sedans. SUVs can offer you all of the same benefits as a sedan, but on top of that, they also give you all of the benefits of having an SUV. Only time will tell what kind of new SUVs we'll see emerge in the future. But with increasing EV range and better technology, we have a feeling that SUVs will almost always stay as popular as they are now. And that's a wrap for this video. Do you think SUVs can sustain this level of popularity in the future? Let us know in the comments below. As always, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.